Hi, how's it going? Welcome to the stream. I am just going to go ahead and share this on Twitter real fast. Hi, welcome to the episode 10 of Exposing the Cult, a podcast in which we take a look at what once was one of the most inclusive communities, the LGBT, and how it has been infiltrated by the cult of gender ideology. Today is a little bit different. Today we are live streaming not only on YouTube but on Twitch. Um, I've got my Twitch chat to sub only because I didn't intend to stream to Twitch, but my Streamlabs is synced through it. So here we are. This is a little bit different and it's new to some of you who follow me on Twitch. If you haven't been following what's been going on, I suggest that you take a look at all of the things on YouTube or Instagram or one of my many TikTok accounts that are pending strikes and bans constantly. Um, we are going to be discussing Dr. Blanchard today, and we're going to talk about Dr. Zucker. So I've got a couple of articles about them and a couple of videos that are like 4 years old. So I was on a Twitter space and this trans identifying man said that all children who have gender dysphoria post puberty are autogynephiliacs based on Dr. Zucker and Dr. Blanchard's studies. And what I can tell you from the videos that I have already watched, this simply is not true. Dr. Blanchard clearly states that there is a difference between a transsexual who, as a child, experiences gender dysphoria and a fully grown male who has autogynephilia. And so there is a difference, and we are going to talk about those today. Let me make sure I just dropped in my live stream there, and I'm gonna go tweet like a little bird. I really love Twitter. The spaces are a lot of fun. It's a dumpster fire, but here we go. Let's see. I think I have an auto tweet set up actually. Let's see. Delete. If I'm not mistaken, I have a bot still. And oh, you know what? That's all right. Tweet. Maybe I don't, but I do now. So if you guys want to get merch, go to exposingthecult.com to support the things that I'm doing. Let's kind of get into it, I guess. I know I didn't post last week. This would be episode 11 or week 11, but we all kind of need a break sometimes, yeah? This is a lot. This research that we're doing is a lot. And it's, when you're fighting TRAs and you're fighting feminists and it's like everyone's coming at you. At the end of the day, gender ideology is the root of the issue. So that's what I'm going to continue to expose. So let's take a look at what autogynephilia is, shall we? All right. So according to the National Library of Medicine, autogynephilia is an underappreciated paraphilia. That bothers me a little bit. This is okay. Advanced Psychosom Med as of 2011. Someone named Anne calls this an underappreciated paraphilia. I don't think that I would say that it's underappreciated. I think that it's shouldn't be appreciated at all, but okay. Abstract. Autogynephilia is defined as a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a female. It is the paraphilia that is theorized to underlie transvestism and some forms of male to female transsexualism. Autogynephilia encompasses sexual arousal with cross-dressing and cross-gender expression that does not involve women's clothing per se. The concept of autogynephilia defines a typology of male to female transsexualism and offers a theory of motivation for one type of male to female. Transsexualism. Autogynephilia resembles a sexual orientation in that it involves elements of idealization and attachment, as well as erotic desire. Nearly 3% of men in Western countries may experience autogynephilia. Its most severe manifestation, male to female transsexualism, is rare but increasing in prevalence. Some theorists and clinicians reject that transsexual typology and theory of motivation derived from autogynephilia. Their objections suggest a need for additional research. The concept of autogynephilia can assist clinicians in understanding some otherwise puzzling manifestations of non-homosexual male to female transsexualism. Autogynephilia exemplifies an unusual paraphilic category called erotic target identity inversions, in which men desire to impersonate or turn their bodies into facsimiles of the persons or things to which they are sexually attracted. So now that we all understand what autogynephilia is, let's kind of talk about it. This is like really a contentious thing. When you see the term online AGP, this is what they're talking about, autogynephiliacs. And there is the camp in which they say that all trans people are AGPs, and there's the camp in which the people say that not all transsexuals are AGPs. Now, while I was doing some of my research before this episode, Dr. Blanchard specifically talks about how he believes that the homosexual male to females specifically, right, who would otherwise be gay, okay, they do not necessarily have autogynephilia. It is those who are heterosexual and transition from male to female that are or majority of are autogynephiliacs, and that's how he categorized them. Now, why is this contentious? Okay, because Dr. Blanchard and Dr. Zucker were both exiled from the gender studies community. I mean, these men worked in this field for like 30 years, and all of a sudden, the trans rights activists came after them, saying they were too stringent on their protocols. You know, these were the doctors who said, hey, you need multiple years of therapy. The TRAs said you are using conversion therapy, essentially. They said by not medically changing and altering the body with medications and surgeries, you are using conversion therapy to prevent them from transitioning. When in reality, they were using safeguards to protect children from potentially having life-altering changes that would otherwise make it unable for them to go back, right? Like once you've medically transitioned, there is no going back. So, I mean, they were trying to safeguard those who did not truly have gender dysphoria. So we're going to take a look at a video. I'm going to take this off the screen real quick. And we're going to start with... actually, we're going to start with a read, okay? Before we get into this video. So this one specifically is about Dr. Zucker. So this says, a doctor has been fired from Gender Identity Clinic, says he feels vindicated after the CAMH apology settlement. And this was in 2018. So this was like 4 or 5 years ago now. It says, a controversial Toronto psychologist said he feels vindicated and liberated after receiving an apology from the country's largest mental health care center for erroneously representing his behavior and work in a public review 3 years ago. Kenneth Zucker headed up the CAMH's Family Gender Identity Clinic for more than 30 years before he was ousted in December 2015, sparked by criticisms that the clinic had been practicing conversion therapy on young people who identify as transgender. CAMH had launched an external review earlier that year. The review found that the clinic focused on intensive assessment and treatment despite current practices favoring watchful waiting and the education and support of parents in accepting their child's gender expression. So I think watchful waiting was not medically transitioning a child, right? That's what watchful waiting was to find out. And I believe in the video that we're going to watch, you can see he does discuss, and it's sourced in the description, by the way. He does discuss having actually, I'm trying to think of the words. He talks about finding out what the root is causing the dysphoria. You know, children who are molested, for instance, experience gender dysphoria more likely so than a child who does not, right? So that's what watchful waiting is, to find out what is going on in their mind or what they're experiencing that is making them uncomfortable in their bodies. For instance, if you look at detransitioner Prisha, she is all on Twitter, she's on YouTube. She talks about how she shared this really beautiful artwork, and it was a woman, and the chest area and the downstairs are just like sitting on the ground next to this body, and it's pencil art, right? It's just drawn in pencil, and she said this is a perfectly good representation of why I transitioned, because when I cut my breasts off, I felt like, you know, I wasn't getting the attention from men that I did not want to receive. And so watchful waiting is meant to see if this is truly gender dysphoria, if transitioning is truly good for the child or not. And let's see. So in this photo, Dr. Ken Zucker stands in front of children's drawings at the Center of Addiction for Mental Health in Toronto. So yeah, 30 years this guy was a gender identity doctor. Although the report also looked specifically at Dr. Zucker's interactions with patients, including a reference to him insulting a patient, he was not consulted. He was fired the same day that it came out. The Clinic for Children and Youth was ultimately shut down as well. Dr. Zucker's departure was polarizing. Rainbow Health Ontario, an organization that works to improve access to health and social services for the LGBTQ community, applauded CAM for commissioning the external review and for its response to the review's findings and recommendations. But while his removal was celebrated by many activists in the transgender community, many of his colleagues were outraged, and more than 500 clinicians and researchers signed a petition in his defense. In Dr. Zucker's review, it sparked a fear that the field of gender dysphoria, where he says there remains many urgent and unanswered clinical and theoretical questions, has been poisoned by politics. Or dare I say, gender ideology, specifically the cult. I think that conflation with politics has made it very difficult for many people in the field to say what we really think. No shit, Sherlock, he said. And I think that it's really sad that in a field where there are many important issues to discuss and work on, that really bright people feel intimidated. Today, the 68-year-old is still working between 6 and 7 days a week, running a private practice in Toronto, and he remains the editor of the Academic Journal Archives of Sexual Behavior. He disputes the idea that he was practicing conversion therapy by not immediately pushing for transition for a child experiencing gender dysphoria. I listen, I stand by what I have said in the past. It is on WebMD. Transgenderism, transitioning children, is absolutely a form of conversion therapy. I think the term conversion therapy is incredibly inflammatory, he said. I think it's been I read two words at once, y'all. I'm sorry. Inappropriately expropriated from the original use of the term, where it was directed at the very conservative, religiously motivated clinicians or pastoral counselors who were seeing primarily homosexual men who didn't want to be gay. There were lots of problems in trying to offer treatment to change an adult's sexual orientation. We know that's a very dubious proposition, but to apply the term to treating a 3-year-old child with gender dysphoria, in my opinion, is an absurd comparison. Personally, I think that if it's a 3-year-old that you're transitioning to the opposite sex, that is conversion therapy. That is, you're converting them through therapy. But okay. He stressed that he assessed each patient on a case-by-case basis and noted that in 1999, his clinic was one of the first in North America to start using hormonal suppression for adolescents to help them transition. Ew, Dr. Zucker. Ew. As part of the settlement with CAM, which was finalized last week. Mind you, this is 2018 again, and is not confidential. He will also receive more than $500,000 in damages, legal fees, and interest. The center has also agreed to pass on his contact information to anyone seeking it. CAM has also posted an apology on its website, noting that the review was intended to identify best practices and how to best serve children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, not to examine the behavior and practices of Dr. Zucker. The apology notes that the report wrongly stated that he referred to a patient as hairy little vermin, among other errors. The allegation is untrue, the statement notes. CAM declined an interview request on Sunday, but said that it stands by its decision to close down the clinic. We believe our modernized approach to delivering services to youth better supports the diverse patients that through best practice and timely care, spokesperson Sean O'Malley said in an email statement on behalf of the center. I feel like I'm going to need to deep dive into this Sean O'Malley character because this statement, we believe in our modernized approach. Okay, your expedited approach, your you don't need to have gender dysphoria to be able to transition approach, the approach where you can go get, testosterone and HRT within the first 10 minutes of your appointment approach, where you're giving double mastectomies to like 13-year-old girls approach. Okay. Sure. Have at that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to watch a section of a YouTube video. It was an interview, and I have to put a headset on for this. It was an interview done with Dr. Zucker, and this is by Benjamin A. Boyce. It was from 4 years ago. It's Gender, Sexuality, and Transition Interviews is what this is categorized under. So we're going to take a look at this segment. This one's called Sexuality versus Identity. And I wanted to focus on this section of the interview, which is an hour and 16 minutes long, because we are talking about AGPs. And sexuality versus identity anyway. So that's why we're going to start here. I think this segment is going to be probably about 20 minutes long. We're going to pause as we go through it and kind of check it out. And then when we get to Dr. Blanchard, I've got a 10-minute segment of another video that Benjamin A. Boyce did. It was interesting that Benjamin is who I found had interviews with both of these doctors. And this was, again, 4 years ago. So this is before, just the crazy boom of gender ideology really hit all of us hard. Okay, I got sound on. Unmute.
In your research and in your knowing, is sexuality more set than identity? You said that identity is a constructive process, and I think that one of the hardest things for us to do as thinking beings is to understand things as a process or as something that changes over time. We like to say that this is that, this is that. Is sexuality something that's more or less innate or usually has a more stable life in the individual than one's identity?
I'll tell you what I believe. I think with regard to males, I think sexual orientation is largely immutable. That it doesn't really change over time in terms of the underlying erotic preference. That doesn't mean a male can behave in sexually different ways, but what is their primary source of arousal is relatively stable. With regard to women, I think that the current perspective is that sexual orientation is more flexible than it is in men. And that's been documented over the last 20 plus years by different researchers who are studying sexual orientation through adolescence and adulthood in women. So One of the most serious researchers in that area is a psychologist named Lisa Diamond, who says that basically we have to throw out the immutability perspective. And she now says that's the case not only for women, but for men. Another psychologist who studies sexual psychophysiology in women, Meredith Chivers, talks about how women are more varied than men in terms of what will arouse them sexually. So there may well be sex differences in mutability, immutability.
Okay, just so that everybody listening knows. Immutability means the state or condition of being unchangeable. These findings contradict previous myths about genetic immutability of intelligence at birth. Oh, I don't know. Christian doctrine of God immutability states that God doesn't change, has never changed, and will never change. Okay. So I don't need the biblical. Why am I getting the biblical meaning of immutability here? Compiled time construct that indicates why? Now there's a lot of different versions of immutability here. But essentially the gist of it is the state or condition of being unchangeable. So he's saying that sexuality in a man is immutable, but it's not in women. That's interesting. So if an autogynephiliac, always an autogynephiliac, is that?
I spoke with a biologist last week who studies mice and development of the impact of testosterone, the impact of sex on development. And later on in our conversation, she spoke about how it's been a pattern in research, not only among mice, but in other fields of research, that we end up studying men a lot more than females. And she said that one of the things that is kind of the case with rats specifically is that it's much easier to study a male than a female rat, at least because the female's going through all these different cycles. It seems like the female has another couple layers of complexity, but there's the caveat that said that it's easier to simplify the male, whereas the female has a lot of variability going on in her biology. Have you seen that that it's the case that females in general are more complex or more malleable than men outside of just sexuality, but with regards to identity and how they shape their identity over time? Or is it just kind of everybody's pretty stupidly complex?
Well, nowadays it'll be hard to get grants if you don't study both sexes and both genders. Well, I'm thinking about, this new surge of adolescents who are presenting with gender dysphoria or a transgender identity, where the sex ratio has tilted from one that used to favor males to one that favors females. And, there are some clinics that are reporting sex ratios of 6 to 9 to 1 of every female to male. Now, does that reflect that adolescent girls are struggling more with gender/identity than males? Because for males, their socialization environment has been more rigid, whereas for females it's been a little more flexible, and maybe at the end of the bell curve it's causing more adolescent girls to question who they are. Maybe. I don't know if we have a definitive answer to that yet.
Okay, before they go on, see, this kind of bothers me a little bit. For a couple of reasons. We have seen a rise in young girls transitioning from female to male. And he sits there and he says, oh, well, maybe it's because we're not as stringent with girls, right? But stringent in what? In how society functions with like gender roles? Maybe the issues that we've been too rigid with the boys and the girls. Like, here's where this bothers me personally, right? Is that we say, well, if you like this truck, then you are a boy. And if you like this doll, then you are a girl. And you can't like the other one. Otherwise, you need to transition. I don't think that's acceptable. I think that kids should just be able to be kids and play with that whatever they want, but learn to love themselves in their body, regardless of what their sex is. And to sit here and say, well, these kids have this gender dysphoria because they don't adhere to playing with dolls. It kind of pisses me off just a little bit, but we're gonna keep on watching. I don't honestly. I think in the earlier interviews, in the earlier section, I kind of started to kind of feel bad for Zucker a little bit, right? Like in that article we read, I think he genuinely was trying to have some stringent lines for trans and kids, but I don't really like him. Don't really like him. But we're gonna push on through the rest of this clip.
I wanted to speak to you about your the development of your clinical practice and how this is. I don't have a total formulation, and I don't know how much time we have to like actually explore this. One of my friends asked me to ask you how the over time, over your career, how the kind of the therapeutic relationship has changed or developed in that time, and with regards to, I guess, assessment and then navigating the individual that you're dealing with towards dealing with their dysphoria or their gender identity.
Well, that makes the assumption that I remember what I thought in the 1970s or 80s. I think that, things evolve. I mean, I'm sure whatever it was that I was thinking as a young graduate student in the 70s hopefully isn't identical to what I think about nowadays. But I think there are certain constants in terms of the importance of doing a comprehensive assessment, not only with the child, but with the family. I think I don't think my developmental perspective has changed. I mean, maybe in the 70s or 80s, I don't even know if I labeled it that way.
Yeah.
But certainly,
Get to the point,
the
Zuck.
developmental perspective is still very important. I think where things have changed is that when one sees different types of families and situations, you may not necessarily be able to formulate a therapeutic recommendation that is going to be identical from one family to the next. So if we are in 2019, the example that comes to mind with regard to children is that, we now have a subgroup of parents who have a child with gender dysphoria or gender dysphoria in the making, who have decided either on their own or in collaboration with a clinician or at the recommendation of a clinician to socially transition their child from one gender to another, and sometimes at a very young age, at 3 or 5 or 7. And
To those who say it doesn't happen, this is a clinician of 30 years who led, as we read, one of the leading gender clinics in North America for 30 years. And he's saying this is happening with 3-year-olds. So.
And I think that the kind of therapeutic help that parents who have adopted that perspective is going to be very different than a family that doesn't want to reduce their child's gender dysphoria in that way. And so I think one has to understand.
When he said, hold on, when he said, in that perspective, when they take, like when in that perspective, the parents who take that approach of socially transitioning their 3-year-old, yeah, these are the people who are in the cult of gender ideology that just blindly follow this. Oh, well, it must be this way, so I'm going to raise them this way. They're completely disregarding that gender dysphoria should not just be just throw everyone in the pool of, just socially transition them and then get them on puberty blockers and testosterone and start chopping off body parts of 13-year-old girls. Like, I don't like Kenneth Zucker because he does endorse for gender dysphoric kids medical transition and medical intervention, and I don't think that should happen. However, Dr. Zucker was one of the clinicians who was genuinely trying to prevent medical intervention for children that should not be transitioned. Do we know the numbers of how many children this is? Colt, do you mean, and sorry, I'm talking to, for those listening, I'm just talking to the comment section real quick. Yeah, so I don't know the number of children. I'm sure we could probably look up, but we'll look that up in a few minutes, the number of children that Dr. Kenneth Zucker worked with over the years. But yeah, this man is killing me. I wonder if it can speed it up. I don't know if you can.
Stand and respect where
Interesting.
each family is coming from, but what the developmental perspective has led me to think is
there you go.
If you don't socially transition your kid at the age of 3 or at age 4, there are probably more options open to you than if you do. And that socially transitioning a kid at the age of 3 or 4 or 5 is probably going to consolidate that developmental pathway.
Okay.
And my own philosophy on that is that I work with families in terms of where they're at and want to offer them help in ways that they think will be helpful. So I don't impose a particular perspective on all families.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I guess the shifts in the larger public sphere introduce another layer of complexity to know how your recommendations are going to be acted out based on the belief structures of the family. Do you think that?
I think that basically what's happening is that parents bring
the belief structures of the family, the gender ideologies, the cult of gender ideology saying it must be this way. Transition the children, transition them. Yeah, I sped it up, Lucky. I got it. I figured it out. He sounds like Dr. Money. Yeah, this doctor gives me the creeps. He gives me the creeps a little bit. You know what? He's an old man. He's like in his 70s now. God, if you ever see this, sorry, Dr. Zucker, but I just don't know. It's probably because I don't think that anybody should be transing kids at all. Oh, okay. So so not from chat saying, according to Wiki, which it's Wikipedia, but since the mid 1970s, Zucker has treated about 500 pre-adolescent gender variant children. He is normal speed at 1.25.
Before they even come to see a clinician or go to a particular clinic,
That's
they have
old
their own
age.
philosophical beliefs and their own theoretical models. And they're going to look for a clinician who they think shares their beliefs.
Okay, he's just confirming what we all know. And they see this push, right? Like we have all these gender affirmation clinics like popping up in the Western countries and cultures, right? That are just affirm the children, just affirm them. And this is an ideological thing that they're pushing on these kids. There are no boundaries in place. I think Zucker genuinely cared about having these safeguards in place for these children. So I will concede to that, right? But I think I can tell it just in the way that this guy is talking and kind of like he had a nonchalant almost chuckle when he started talking about these philosophies, because these philosophies are why those activists had that review done of him and had him booted from his from the clinic that he was at for 30 years. And I mean, hey, that's why he won a bunch of money.
Yeah.
It's just, that makes sense. I mean, adults who have depression might think the only way that they're going to be helped is medication. Other adults just want to see somebody in talk therapy. Some adults want both, so they're going to look for a clinician who shares their perspective.
Yeah.
And that's what the free world is all about.
Yeah, I guess so.
The free world, except for the fact that all of these clinicians are literally coming out and saying, if we do not affirm, we are afraid to get fired. So
let the market decide. Is there like a...
That's dangerous. It's dangerous. We should not be allowing the market to decide. Really, clinicians should be in control and trying to mitigate how this treatment is happening to children. This is a problem. Let the market decide. No, that's why we're here. And this was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, guys.
A base of literature or a book or some sort of collection of essays or papers on this term consolidation. I find it fascinating. There's something very useful, it seems, about just that concept. Has that just been around for several decades, or is this a useful tool that you've picked up along the way somewhere?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just free associating now.
Yeah.
I mean, Erik Erikson wrote about identity back in the 50s. And then I think some developmental psychologists who studied adolescence talked about the consolidation of ego identity.
Okay.
I'd have to dig around to see if that term...
Even Ben's like, yeah, okay, man.
Is it just kind of a
okay
generic verb that I've...
But by it, you mean that in with regards to the developmental model, the psyche is going through different stages of kind of building itself, and consolidation is what you mean, like where these different concepts just come in and form a binding structure that is just repeated through time, that just becomes a part of one's character or personality. Is that kind of
I mean,
what happens?
I think if we think about our sense of self in general, we would probably say that the way we are now bears certain similarities to the way we were 10 years ago, 30 years ago, but there are other aspects of one's identity that are more flexible. So, for example, sometimes I talk about political identity. When people were 20, they might have been communists, but at 40, they're Republicans.
Yeah. Okay. So there's these different layers of how one identifies, depending on the context, and depending on the social context, how you plug into other things.
Yeah.
But it seems like a gender identity, if we subtract the social level of it, there's aspects of the identity of how I plug into myself or how I feel okay with myself. And those things don't seem as malleable, or maybe they are as malleable.
Well, it's interesting, at the public venue last week in Vancouver when Megan Murphy gave her talk, she said she didn't have a gender identity. She was a woman with personality traits. And that's a little different than my own thinking over the years, where I've always had this perspective that gender identity is an early core part of one's sense of self that remains, for most people, pretty stable over the course of development. Is that simply because there are these internal structures that get consolidated, or is there also continuous feedback from the social environment?
Shouldn't you be able to answer that? You're the doctor.
Constantly being reinforced for how you perform your gender identity, as Judith Butler would say.
Yeah, right. What's next on your plate? Do you have another book coming out, or?
Nope, don't care about another book. Okay. So let me see if there's anything else in here where he was talking about gender and sex. What is gender? Let's look a little bit at his research real quick. I don't think we're gonna watch 2 minutes. Oh, it's like 4 minutes. Let's take a look a little bit at his research.
So I was sort of interested in things that were at the margin in general, and I did my master's thesis on normative gender development in children.
So
and
growing
then
up heterosexual or
serendipitously, I
without
came
transitioning?
across Richard Green's 1974 book called Sexual Identity Conflict in Children and Adults.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard looked pretty weird based on his picture, and the book seemed really interesting. I really had no idea what I was reading, but it seemed interesting. And then I moved to Toronto to do my PhD,
how he got started.
And I wanted to spend time doing clinical work with children at what was then called the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, which was basically down the street from the University of Toronto. And the serendipitous event was that a child psychiatrist named Susan Bradley had just started a gender identity clinic for children and adolescents. And I met with her, and the rest, shall we say, is history.
Yeah.
What a dark history. 500 children. 500 children he treated for gender dysphoria. And I wonder how many of them actually transitioned. All right. So next we're going to go ahead and take a look at an article about Blanchard's typology of male to female transsexualism. Okay. And this has to do with the brain. So this is another doctor who was also impacted by trans rights activists who decided that his work was not beneficial to the cult's groupthink. So this is another doctor who worked for decades in gender identity, helped to get transgenderism to where it was, but then, oh no, they decided he wasn't doing it exactly the way that the ideological cult members wanted it to be. It wasn't fast enough. It wasn't being fast-tracked. It wasn't being done the way they wanted it. So this is from the National Library of Medicine. This is an official website of the United States government. Archives of Sexual Behavior. New MRI studies support the Blanchard typology of male to female transsexualism. This is published online on July 8th, 2011 by James M. Cantor. Two independent empirical articles have recently appeared in the literature that, taken together, bear out an hypothesis Blanchard in 2008 postulated in the archives about brain development in transsexualism. The brains of both homosexual and heterosexual male to female transsexuals probably differ from the brains of typical heterosexual men, but in different ways. In heterosexual male to female transsexuals, the difference does not involve sex dimorphic structures, and the nature of the difference is a shift in the female typical direction. If there is any neuroanatomic intersexuality, it is in the homosexual group. In heterosexual male to female transsexuals, the difference may not involve sex dimorphic structures at all, and the nature of the structural difference is not necessarily along the male to female dimension. So what they're saying is that the male to female transsexual brain is more similar to a homosexual brain than, like, it's not talking about a woman's brain. There's all these conversations about, oh, transsexual brains are like women's brains. Blanchard says it's closer to a homosexual male's brain. If anybody else took that statement any differently than what I just read, please let me know in the comment section, because that is exactly how I just took that. So Blanchard's prediction follows from studies that have repeatedly shown that the homosexual male to female transsexuals are female shifted in multiple sexually dimorphic characteristics, whereas the heterosexual male to female transsexuals are not. For example, homosexual male to female transsexuals are sexually attracted to natal males, express greater interest in female typical activities even in childhood, and are naturally effeminate in mannerisms. In contrast, heterosexual male to female transsexuals are indistinguishable from non-transsexual natal males on these variables. The heterosexual transsexuals are still distinct from typical males in other ways, however, such as by manifesting autogynephilia, the erotic interest in or sexual arousal in response to being or seeming female. So that would probably be, well, not probably, in my humble opinion, a trans identifying male who claims to be a lesbian is a heterosexual transsexual. And what this is saying is that this is how they manifest on autogynephilia. You're right, Colt. The question is, why do we entertain all of this? The consistent detection of cross-sex features among homosexual male-to-female transsexuals, but not among heterosexual male-to-female transsexuals, led Blanchard to predict that the cross-sex pattern would also emerge at the level of brain anatomy and be limited to the homosexual male-to-female transsexuals. That prediction now appears to be the case, with Remedi et al. In 2010 supporting his prediction for the homosexual transsexuals, and Savick and Arver 2010 for the heterosexual transsexuals. So this is saying that the heterosexual transsexuals, the men who transition to women who still like women, are autogynephiliacs. The gay men who transition to women but want to be with men are not heterosexuals. Yeah. Colt, see, that's the problem, right? The issue is, he says, let the transsexuals blend in like they used to and stop making it some culture to join. The issue is that it's become a cult of gender ideology. I mean, okay, we just painstakingly got through Zucker together, right? Like we just got through Zucker together. And he was saying these philosophical ideologies of individual families and you know, goodness, what was his name? Boyce is, makes, it's the free market, haha, and they make a joke about it. But this cult of gender ideology is swaying the quote unquote free market to make this like an end all be all resolution to trans your kid. And that's the problem. Okay, so the Remedi team used an MRI technique called diffusion tensor imaging to compare homosexual male to female transsexuals with non-transsexual heterosexual control males and with a non-transsexual heterosexual control female. They contrasted the male controls with the female controls to identify the sex dimorphic portions of the brain, and then contrasted the homosexual transsexuals with each group of controls on the dimorphic brain regions so identified. The initial contrasts identified 6 sex dimorphic brain regions. The homosexual transsexual sample was intermediate in volume on all 6 brain structures, significantly different from male controls on 5 of the 6, and significantly different from the female controls on all 6. That is, these male to female transsexuals were different from the control males, shifted towards the female direction on all parameters. Savick and Arver applied anatomical MRIs with an analogous research design, identifying the sex dimorphic portions of the brain and contrasting the, this time, heterosexual transsexual sample with each control sample on the sex dimorphic brains regions. Of the 8 brain regions that distinguished male from female brains, the heterosexual transsexual sample differed from male controls on none. Of the 4 brain regions that distinguished these heterosexual transsexuals from the male controls, sex dimorphism was present in none. As Savick and Arvers themselves emphasized, contrary to primary hypothesis, no sex atypical features with signs of feminization, quote unquote, were detected in the transsexual group. The present study does not support the dogma that a male to female transsexual has atypical sex dimorphism in the brain, although the statement should have been restricted to refer to heterosexual male to female transsexuals only. Also meriting emphasis is that although these data disconfirm that the heterosexual type has a feminized brain pattern, the data nonetheless confirms that heterosexual transsexuals have a brain structure distinct from that of typical non-transsexual persons. Their gender identity is not transient or ephemeral characteristic, but a likely innate and immutable characteristic emerging from their particular brain structure. So it says open access. This article is distributed under the terms of Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial License, which permits any non-commercial use, distribution, and reproduction in any medium provided to the original authors and sources are credited. I credited you. You're credited in my description. Don't come for me, U.S. government. So, okay. And there's a bunch of Blanchard's work here actually referenced on the site as well, if you want to look more into that. It looks like they've got a lot of studies referenced. It disconfirms that heterosexual. So they're saying there's a difference between homosexual transsexuals, which when we talk about homosexual transsexuals, we mean a male transitioning to a female who likes males. So they're saying that they do lean towards less towards men and more towards women, but it's not the exact same as a woman's brain as some like to claim. It says so right here. And then it's saying that heterosexual males they're nothing like male or female. They are of their own category. Am I mistaking that, chat? Like, I read that. I'm interpreting that correctly. Am I not? Their gender identity is not a transient or ephemeral characteristic, but likely innate and immutable characteristic emerging from their particular brain structure. Ay, ay, ay. All right, we're going to watch a video. And this is going to be a video with, so I have like a 5-minute clip of Dr. Ray Blanchard talking about autogynephilia. So I'm going to pop up YouTube again. And again, we've got Benjamin A. Boyce on the screen. He has a lot of really great videos. If you haven't found Benjamin A. Boyce, he's got like 90,000 followers almost. You should definitely check him out. He's got a lot.
I have no idea how this happened. Absolutely none. I picked up hundreds of followers while I was locked out of my account.
Oh, he had a Twitter.
I have no concept how these things work.
Real quick, he made a tweet and it pissed off a bunch of trans rights activists. And here, what he's talking about, he's like, I'm not that kind of doctor.
Or the mechanism by which suddenly. Well, I know that people did tweet about my having been locked out, and a few people blogged about it, and it was beginning to leach its way into more.
Real quick, Lucky says, what about bisexual brains? I don't know if they did a study on bisexual. I think that they used the controls of heterosexual, right? Heterosexual men and heterosexual women as the controls to make those comparisons, and for good reason, right? Because what that study proves is that there's a variation between heterosexual trans people, or transsexuals is what it says, heterosexual and homosexual transsexuals. So Colt says, so regular guys are separate how from a male to female brain standard? So the male and female, I'm gonna look up video, like, so I'll look for some pictures. We'll get through this video, and then we're going to start looking for. We'll see if we can find some images. I would love to see some brain images, because That would be interesting.
mainstream kind of media outlets.
Mhm.
I wouldn't
Blah,
have
blah,
thought a
blah. I
company as
paused
big
it,
as Twitter could
started
care
it too
less.
soon.
But
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know how it happened.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a question of your influence on the conversation. And I had you on before, and you gave some very some very valuable information and included it in my series on transsexualism and gender and sexuality. Are you really aware of that? Do you accept the mantle of like being this expert that's kind of, I guess you deserve it because you did all the work, but it's kind of, when we talk about it, you say it was so long ago, it's kind of after the fact.
Well, when I didn't start on Twitter with the intention of becoming, of assuming a kind of educational role. Gradually, it began to dawn on me that there are a lot of people out there who really want information, but they don't know where to start because it's hard to get access to scholarly journals unless you belong to a university or a hospital or one of those few institutions that's going to subscribe to journals. Journal subscriptions are expensive.
I lied.
So
I started 4 minutes too early.
no, I don't think people get that confused. What they do is say gender identity disorder has nothing to do with sexual orientation.
Okay.
That is a lie.
Okay.
Gender identity disorders very much have to do with people's erotic preferences. It's just not as straightforward as you might like. But that's why I made the point of insisting, no, gender identity disorders are not paraphilias. That is not the same thing as saying gender identity disorders have nothing to do with sexual orientation or paraphilias.
Okay. That's a very rich kind of distinction that I've tried to investigate here and there, but it seems like a very big topic. Like, what is the relationship between one's gender expression and one's erotic, erotic being? Have you thought about that? Is there just
sure, I've thought about it and I've written about it, and so have a hell of a lot of other people.
Yeah.
But, this is, again, we're talking about stuff that's behind paywalls. Articles perhaps that were already taken for granted before the internet. And so, my God, you'd have to go to a physical library and pick up these heavy assemblages of paper. It's out of the question. But people have known forever that there are different classes of transsexuals, that these different types can be quite dissimilar to each other when you meet them in person. People have known for a long time that the childhood behavior of transsexuals is not that different from the childhood behavior of many gay men and lesbian women who have a perfectly normal gender identity in adulthood. And people have known for decades and decades that some guys who start out with fetishistic cross-dressing, masturbating into a pair of panties, and then, I'm done with that. For the time being, sometimes progress to the point where they have a full-time desire to be as the opposites, to live as the opposite sex. This stuff has been known for, 50, 60, 70 years.
Yeah. So sometimes one's gender expression, is that just a kind of a natural outflowing of the personality, or is it somehow related to the kind of attention that I want to attract? If I act this way, then I will attract the attention of the people that I see being attracted to that behavior.
I honestly think that attracting partners is not a primary motivation in either of the main types of transsexualism. I think if you look at the childhood behavior of the homosexual type transsexuals, they start very early imitating the opposite sex in a systematic way, which kind of suggests at some level, some pre-verbal level, they have come to the conclusion, I am one of that kind of person, and I'm going to imitate what those kinds of people do.
Interesting.
And these are the kids who end up by being extremely tomboyish girls or extreme sissy boys. And some of them at puberty kind of normalize in gender identity and end up as lesbians and gays, and some of them don't normalize in gender identity, and they can continue on this trajectory of becoming transsexuals. But the early
Nat, are you still there? Can you find out how many kids that Dr. Ray Blanchard worked with who had gender dysphoria? Because now I'm curious. So let's see, where are we at now? 27. Yeah, that was about the clip of this that I wanted to. Dr. Ray obviously speaks much faster, a little bit more eloquently than Dr. Zucker, but falls into the same bandwagon, right? Now, the work that he has done, and there's so many arguments. I'm gonna switch to my main cam. I am in arguments on Twitter this week with TRAs and radical feminists and everyone alike, right? Because my fight is gender ideology. At the end of the day, I have a child, I'm a mother, and I have a responsibility to make sure that my child is not brought up in an ideology that if he even shows signs of being interested of something that's not outside of his gender binary norm, that they'll try to transition him without my knowledge. This is unacceptable to me. My child is not a child of the state. My child is not a child of a cult. My child is mine and my husband's alone. Period, point blank. It is our decision and our right in how our child is raised. And if our child has any issues, we need to take care of them and address them. But what's happening and what we're seeing as these doctors are basically like they said, oh, free market, right? It's a free market to take these kids to whatever doctor is going to align with their philosophical ideas and perspectives. And that's dangerous when they all fear getting fired and feel like they have to sign off on transitioning this kid because they don't want to be reported for not transitioning them. Dr. Ray Blanchard, he gives me scientist vibes, like actual scientific vibes. You're right. I think it was Lucky who said the Dr. Money reference. I get Dr. Money vibes from Dr. Zucker, and I get scientist vibes from Ray Blanchard. I mean, he did the study on the brains, and they used the controls. Well, I'm sorry. There was it was confirmed. He made the hypothesis, and it was Remedi and Savick and Arver who made the confirmations, right? They did the work of his hypothesis that there was a difference between these transsexuals. And I go further and I say, and this is why I'm pissing off the feminists, right? Because they're like true trans, whatever. And then they call women like myself a troon. And I really don't care. At this point, I don't give a shit. I'm fighting gender ideology, and I will continue to do so to protect the children and to fight for my rights and my terminology not to be taken away. And I will do that with anybody who is willing to stand alongside me, man, woman, even trannies. I'm willing to stand at their side if they're standing up and saying we need to put up safeguards. We should not be transitioning children. And then when it comes to things like bathrooms and locker rooms, domestic violence shelters and stuff, if they don't agree with protecting women in those spaces, then that is where my line is drawn, because I'm not going to cave on those. I'm just not going to cave on them. Right. And so my focus right now is how do we get the shit out of the schools and protect the kids. Right. So this doctor, by the way, he has clearly identified, and these doctors, this study that clearly identified that heterosexual male to female transsexuals and homosexual male to female transsexuals have different brains, right? I would go so far as to say the heterosexuals are the male to females are those who fall into the lines of transgender in gender ideology, the autogynephiliacs that are forcing themselves on us into her app, into lesbian spaces. They're the ones with a full beard and a dick and saying, I'm a lesbian, you're transphobic for not dating me. That's a transgender. That is a heterosexual autogynephiliac as per the study. The transsexuals are those that are homosexuals, and they transitioned because that's how they dealt with their homosexuality, like that they needed to express themselves with that gender. Yeah, so much is based off of Dr. Money and Dr. Kinsey. We talked about Dr. Money in episode 1, and then Dr. Kinsey. I'm trying to think of which episode that was. I think I touched on Dr. Kinsey. It's been a couple of weeks. It might have been episode 9 where I touched on Dr. Kinsey, actually. Yeah. But Dr. Blanchard talked about this autogynephilia, and the reason that I wanted to look up Zucker and I wanted to look up Blanchard was because, like I mentioned at the beginning of this live stream, a transsexual came in, someone who says they're a transsexual, but then they said that they're an AGP, so they're transgender, and I will die on that hill. This transgender, okay, came into a space and said that all children who exhibit gender dysphoria post-puberty, and I might be too far from my mic now, are autogynephiliacs. And that pissed me off. And there were other transsexuals in the room, and this tranny comes in and says, yeah, well, so is this person and this person, they're all AGPs. And I said, how can you deduce that? Well, Dr. Zucker and Dr. Blanchard's studies, they prove that all of the male to females are autogynephiliacs. But this study is saying that is not the case. And I think that it's dangerous in a society where we are normalizing transitioning children, which I will die on the hill that they are using conversion therapy, medical conversion therapy, to transition a child, right? So they are transitioning these children, and there are actual people who seem to believe that those children are by default autogynephiliacs. No. Homosexual gay boys who are transitioned into female, into girls, right? Because they'll never be female. But these homosexual boys are not autogynephiliacs. They are victims of gender ideology. They are victims of a cult ideology, just like the young girls who are transitioned when they're little for not falling in line with what a girl should be. They are absolutely 100% not autogynephiliacs. By the way, that is a word for the men. I don't even think that you could, is there a word for women? Someone said to me in a Twitter thread, well, women are sexually aroused at them being a woman. Oh, come on. Really? Because they feel good about themselves? That's so I'm a feminist. Like, feel empowered, love yourself, love your body, feel good about it. That is not autogynephilia. Me loving myself and my body. Yes, Lucky, you were there. You were in that space. That space was horrifying, was it not? That's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this today. But I digress. Sorry, I got distracted by chat. But here's the thing. A woman feeling good in her body is not the same thing as a man being so aroused at putting on the panties of a woman and dressing as a woman. Like Caitlyn Jenner, autogynephiliac. I will die on that hill. Buck Angel, transsexual. These are my opinions. Blair White, transsexual. As far as I know, they're gay. Buck has a wife, and Blair, if I'm pretty sure, I'm like 99.9 certain, Blair dates men. So, the difference is the homosexual, and now I'm gonna take a poll. I'm gonna take a poll to see how many. But see, here's the tricky part. Okay, here's the tricky part. Because gender ideology has these men believing that they are women and they are lesbians, all right? And so they identify as gay because they say they're lesbians. They're not actually gay. They're not homosexual. So this is where gender ideology is conflating things and making things difficult, right? Because we know when this study is talking about heterosexual transsexuals, it is men who want to be women to date women. But these ideologues, they'll say, I'm gay, I'm a member of the LGB, but they only date women and they're trying to become a woman. And so they will not admit that they're heterosexual because it goes against their ideology. Like they won't process it in their brains. But that could also be the meds. Earlier, Lucky, you made a comment. You said, I spoke with Lancic last night about the hormones, and she said that they shrink the brain as well. So I'm curious, too, because it doesn't mention this in the actual study, right? Like, I didn't see it say, are these male to female transsexuals? Now, was the brain scans done prior to transition or after transition? Because that's a very important control too, right? You have gender dysphoria. Let's take a scan of your brain. You've been on these meds for years. Let's take a scan on your brain. Like, we don't have enough brain scans over the years to be able to see how the brain changes over time because of these meds. So that's very important. But like, it shrinks like the actual brain. I'm thinking about like the neurons and this stuff like that too. There's a saying, when you walk around with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's fitting for these transgender people. They see every child as a troubled individual that needs to be liberated. Oh, Lucky, you can't drop links here. I'm so sorry. I don't know if that's a setting that I have. Let's see. I'm gonna see if there are any. I wonder. Let me go to this. Supporting his prediction, Savick and Archer. I'm gonna click on this. Sex dimorphism of the brain in male to female transsexuals. I'm gonna bring us back over to this one real quick. Make sure we have the site open. Okay. Sex dimorphism of the brain in male to female transsexuals. Gender dysphoria is suggested to be a consequence of sex atypical cerebral differentiation. We tested this hypothesis in a magnetic resonance study of voxel-based morphometry, and structural volumetry in 48 heterosexual men and women, and 24 gynophilic male to female transsexuals. Specific interest was paid to gray matter and white matter fraction, hemispheric asymmetry, and volumes of the hippocampus, thalamus, caudate, and putamen. Like hetero men, male to female transsexuals displayed larger gray matter volumes than hetero women. In the cerebellum and lingual gyrus, and smaller gray matter and white matter volumes in the precentral gyrus, both male groups had similar hippocampal volumes than hetero women. As in hetero men, but not hetero women, the right cerebral hemisphere and thalamus volume was in male to female transgender larger, than the left. None of these measures differed between hetero men and male to female transsexuals. Male to female transsexuals displayed also singular features and differed from both control groups by having reduced thalamus and putamen volumes and elevated gray matter volumes in the right insular and inferior frontal cortex of an area covering the right angular gyrus. The present data do not support the notion that brains of male to female trans are feminized. The observed changes in male to female transgender bring attention to the networks inferred in processing of body perception. The present data does not support the notion that male to female trans are feminized. That like just debunks all of their fucking arguments. Every time someone says, "Hey, Angela," not sorry, bad timing. Bad timing for me to respond to chat. Anytime someone sits there and tells you, "Oh, well, trans women have the same brains as women," wrong. And this is exactly why Blanchard was exiled from gender ideology, like affirmation and all of that stuff. That's why this man, well, there was a Twitter thread too. You can watch the video. It's linked in the description. That's why this man was kicked out by the TRAs. The TRAs didn't like Zuck because Zuck was, in their mind, committing conversion therapy for putting up safeguards before transitioning children medically, which I can support. Don't like the man, but I can still support that he was trying to use safeguards and make sure that the wrong children weren't permanently being transitioned. And Blanchard, he's not liked because his hypothesis has been proven to be true, and gender ideology is trying to force us to believe incorrectly that these men have our brains. And it's literally here in black and white and highlighted in blue. The observed changes in male to female bring attention to the networks inferred in processing of body perception. It's not that their brain is firing off like a woman's. It is that it is perceiving reality as though it is a woman. And that is different. That is so fucking different. Perception and reality are not always the same. That's just the truth of it. I actually, you know what? I was kind of dreading looking up these doctors because I didn't know what I was going to find out. But I'm actually not mad. This was super informative. I hadn't looked into sex dimorphism in the brains before. And so I feel a little bit more educated tonight. I hope those of you who've been hanging out in the chat feel like you've learned a lot as well. And, so Lucky, what I will do is after the podcast tonight, because I'm going to have to update a couple of things and throw in my intro on YouTube and stuff, because doing the live did not allow me to. I tried to play my intro video, not so great on just the generic video on the computer, but it looks great when I put it into Adobe. But what I'll do is I'll actually drop the link to that interview that you did on your podcast with X Lancic, who you said is a clinician that talked about the brain shrinkage because of the hormones, right? So I will definitely update my description to have that. So just DM me that link and I will do that. Happy to check that out. By the way, everybody, if you're here, some of you know Lucky. I can see that in the chat. I was on Lucky's podcast last week, and they are going to be live tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern, right, Lucky? She's going to be live on her channel for her podcast, Fearlessly Authentic. They do great work over there, and they do a lot of interviews and research, and I had a really great time on the podcast last week, and I'm grateful that you invited me to be on it. It was a good experience for me. I'm probably going to get closing here soon. I do want to talk about next podcast. I want to talk about feminism and queer theory and how queer theory was infiltrated into feminism, because it's a dark truth. And like I've said before, we women, we have to take accountability for our part and how this is manifested in the way that it's manifested. And unfortunately, that's with queer theory into feminism. One more thing I am going to talk about before we go is the Red Tent Collective. There is, and I'm pulling up the website right now. This is an organization that I am a part of. We have just getting started. We're working on petitions in the UK and in Canada. In the US, we are working on filing a 501c3, and we want to be official. We're working to start a blog and a podcast talking about women's history, women's rights. This is specifically for, and men can join as well if you would like to keep updated with petitions to support these women's movements that we're trying to work on. But this is our website, and you can click join us and sign up. And there is join forces. You enter your name and your email. We've got some great videos going on. We're also on TikTok, and I believe there's an Instagram and a Facebook. So we're slowly but steadily trying to grow. And as you can see, I've added the Red Tent Collective below me as well. And so that is what that is from. We've got petitions, and we've got, which you can't see here. We've got initiatives that we support represented here on the bottom of our page, and they kind of hang out here so you can find out a little bit more about us. Ooh, Samsara Sings is coming on. Oh, awesome. Yeah. So 9 p.m. tonight, Samsara Sings is going to be on your podcast. I think that's wonderful. And I will be lurking and hanging out and watching tonight in the chat. So again, I just want to say thank you to everybody who hung out with me tonight. This was an experience to do it on a live stream. This is a lot quicker than had I done this on my own. Because I find that when I'm making the podcast episodes, I will just giving away the behind the scenes. It's not as flawless as it appears to be. I will read to myself and I'll stumble and then I'll say, "Oh fuck," and then I'll have to stop it and then I'll have to re-record it and I'll read I'll have like a 20-minute segment and then I'll get mad and then I have to edit and so before I drop it in. When I save it, immediately I go rename it and I say cut off after ideology or whatever the word is that I said that I want to cut off at, because I'll never be able to figure out the timestamp when I'm dumping in like 20 clips into something to edit. And then it takes hours for the upload. And I have the best internet that you can get here, unfortunately. But don't forget, check out the redtentcollective.org. Go to exposingthecult.com to support me, buy my merch. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. And yeah, I will see you guys again very soon.